Well, welcome everybody to Literature Reviews Don't Have to Be Scary. Um, I'm Dr. Jayna Bonfini. I think I had Angela in Grief and Crisis, Patty's in my doctoral cohort, and Nicholas, I think, did we email or something? Your name sounds familiar, or maybe you were in one of my other classes, but regardless, welcome. And today we're going to talk about the dreaded literature reviews. So literature reviews are often the source of a lot of anxiety for grad students. They can seem overwhelming, and the expectations for what should be accomplished can be ambiguous. So the concept of the literature review is likely intimidating because I think the connotation is the different parts of the title, right? The literature, it's like, oh, it sounds so sort of fancy. It sounds kind of, up there and highbrow. And how much are you supposed to do? How much are you supposed to research? How much are you supposed to write? The review also gives out the assumption that the reviewer is in the position of this passive audience member who looks on from the outside of all that's going on with the literature, and there's not much activity or agency. Both are sort of incorrect, right? We'll talk about in this presentation, what we do as active researchers and scholars as we go through the literature. So here are the learning objectives. If you signed up, you probably saw these as well when you registered for the session. So the purpose of our literature review is to really demonstrate to your reader that you have a good understanding of the topic that you are discussing. It demonstrates that you know how to critically evaluate other academic work, and it also demonstrates that you understand how your work and your topic relates to the other academic research that's out there. Sometimes I think what happens is we think about the literature review as we have to include absolutely everything, and we do not, right? It's so that we can understand specifically how the literature relates to your topic. So if, for example, for doctoral students, when they come up with their research question, Patty knows this all too well, you have your question and then you target your literature around those questions. Thank you, LoriAnn, for fixing Teams. You are magical. You are a woman of many, many, many talents. Right. And so you have to sort of narrow that window, because if you try to include everything, you're never going to get done with your dissertation and you'll never finish your paper. So there are some characteristics of effective literature reviews. The first is to outline important trends in the research. So if you are, addressing a paper that is covering sort of new information. So she's not on here, but one of my master's level students, when she wrote her signature assignment for research methods and program eval in 638, she was looking at recent trends in alcohol related deaths with women ages 25 to 45 because of the pandemic. And so she asked some pretty interesting research questions. So she wanted to analyze these trends in light of COVID, in light of responsibilities, in light of sort of financial stressors. So, for her, she had to target a certain body of literature, but she was really narrowing her scope. Other folks, they might say, okay, we have, this one sort of mental health diagnoses, but people say you have to treat it in this manner. Are there other treatments that could work? Are there other interventions that might be a good idea? So why don't we go ahead and look at the strengths and weaknesses of the research and see whether or not it will fit the criteria, to see if maybe we need to expand, to maybe see if what is out there is just very limited. I'll show you an example soon, but I'm sure several of you are probably familiar with some of the replication issues in psychology. There's all these seminal studies that were put out and people were like, wow, that sounds great. And it were adopted as fact. And then we find out years later that no, that power pose, when you stand in front of the mirror and you're like, I got this, that's not really a thing. Right, so that the research there was faulty. So to assess the weaknesses and strengths of research that's already out there, right? Nothing is completely set in stone. Isn't that the greatest part about science, right? Is that we can continue to evolve with new information. So I think that's pretty cool. I also like seeing gaps in knowledge. And I will say one of the things I love about teaching research methods and doing sort of the dissertation classes is I get to see what's out there, because you're all doing the research and then you bring it to me and then I get to read it. But one thing that I noticed, there was one of my students, she did this whole comparison with treating OCD with CBT in young women. And there's just like no studies out there. It was like we did studies, on older adults, we did studies on teens, we did studies on young men, and we just extrapolated and said, and it works. And it works. And she's like, there was really nothing out there. She's like, yeah, sometimes they were put into, this pool of population. She's like, but there was no target. And that's sort of what she would like to do. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe that there is nothing out there in the literature. How is this possible? And we looked and we scoured, we employed those librarians and they helped us along. And there is not much out there at all. So that's kind of cool to figure out where those gaps are. And then also, like, let's establish the need for the current project that you're working on and or future projects. For those who are tasked with the dissertation process, part of their future chapter 5 is like, now where do we go? And so usually in their research, they're establishing their need for their study, but they're also starting to generate ideas of things that they can do later, which is very, very cool, because they can keep it going, right? They're not only just, scholars here, but they're also researchers, for life. So here are the general steps for writing that literature review: the planning, the researching, the reading, the analyzing, drafting, revising. These are all parts of the steps. There's 6 of them, and we have to walk up all of the steps to get there. You can't skip steps. They should probably go in order. The revising step takes the longest, right? Because writing is this iterative and recursive process where you do your first draft, and after that, then the real work begins, because then we start moving things, adding things. I have my little PhD diary memes. Yes, I follow nerdy accounts about research and all kinds of other things. Please don't judge me. I follow that, and I follow my teenage daughter. That's really like all I follow. So it can be scary. It can be really intimidating, especially when you're writing something like chapter 2 of a dissertation. It becomes, for a lot of people, it's Mount Everest, especially people who are doing qualitative research, where they're not only doing an extensive review on their topic at hand, but they're also looking at the theoretical underpinnings too. So it can get pretty unwieldy. For some people, though, Patty, who love their topic, it's almost like it's fun to write because they know a lot about it. They read that literature anyway, and so for them it's like super easy to pull in. So for anybody who is writing their big signature assignment for 638, or who is in this like, oh, I'm going to be in dissertation soon, please, I beg of you to pick a topic that you love and or know a lot about, because then it won't seem like such a heavy lift. That's my please. Just because someone gives you a suggestion, no, only if you like it. Only if you like it. So those are some of the steps, and we're going to go through each of them. Oh, Betty's here. Betty. So here is, again, like Twitter. But so a lot of times people think that the literature review is, hi, Betty. Why is it so cold in Georgia today, Betty?
Say again?
I said, why is it so cold in Georgia today?
Confused.
I don't understand. So what people think the literature is, it's like, Betty Johnson says this, and Patty Lindsay says that, and Julia Johnson said this. Da da da. Like, that's not what it is. Okay. So when I am looking at comps, some of you might be writing comps for the PhD program soon. I see a lot of really good research where people pull in all these relevant studies, and then it reads like an annotated bibliography. And Dr. Stretch, I think we had a conversation about this, and she said something really, really funny to me. She's like, it's like a cocktail party, right? When you talk about a conversation, and when people are talking, it's not like, and then this person said this, and then that person said this. They all mingle, right? They all mix, right? So oftentimes what we have to do is we start with determining the question, right? And then we write a plan, and then we search for studies, and then we do the sifting to find the golden nuggets, right? Not all of it's relevant. And then we have to extract the data and assess the quality. So I liked this graphic because I thought it was beautiful. And I think it describes a lot. That little systematic review, go ahead and table that. That's not part of this. This is part of something else. But I like the funneling approach because I think it really speaks to what we're trying to do here. Planning is a huge part of the process. So when you think about your research question and topic, I really recommend starting to make a preliminary outline. I think that that could be a really helpful thing to help you to focus your topic and to help you focus the direction of your search. For focusing, it's like, what is your specific thesis, problem, or research question that the literature review helps you to define, right? And then, the other bonus part is when you identify the focus, it allows you to both sort and categorize information and also completely eliminate irrelevant information. And that's really important because, we only have so much time, right? We need to be able to say, yes, it's tangential. Patty's heard me many times in our dissertation seminar say, put it in the parking lot. Like if you think it could be relevant later, parking lot. But if it's not directly relevant now, like I don't want you to waste your time on it. And I've seen plenty of signature assignments for 638 where people start going off in tangents and I'm like, this isn't related to your topic at all. Like this is, you did all of this great work and this beautiful writing, right? You worked extremely hard on it and this whole section isn't relevant, right? Like let's be very focused and targeted. There's only so many hours in a day, right? Type is also really important. It's like, what type of literature review are you conducting? And sort of what's your theoretical approach to it? For some people who, again, like I said, they're going to do qualitative research, it is very theory centric and theory based, and it has to be grounded in a particular kind of framework. If somebody is thinking about maybe a public policy, I have a student who is doing some research on the school to prison pipeline and how sort of the Drug Free Schools Act and all of these other policy prescriptions influenced school policies and how it's trickled down. So she's starting with sort of the history of that and the basics of that, and then launching into sort of current things and trickle down effect and data and whatnot. So, for her, she had to ground it in something first and then talk about the literature and the data that has followed. And then lastly, scope, right? What is the scope? What types of sources are you using? How do you know when you're done, right? And so we'll get to part of that because we do need to be very intentional about our scope because not everything is relevant, right? I know I'm kind of a broken record on that, but not everything is relevant. Oftentimes, some students, they won't even know where to look. They're used to just typing in a Google search bar, their topic. And sometimes they get Wikipedia, which I do not recommend. But here at UC, we do have the library system here, and you can search journal titles. I recommend when you type in something in the search bar, you'll get the little cue to log in. Make sure you log in so that you can get full text response, so that you can see every article in detail. I think that's really helpful. However, if you have trouble, we have amazing librarians at UC, and I've had plenty of students request assistance with a project. Some of my doc students, they're looking for a particular assessment or particular data, or some sort of article because they think that it's out there, but they're not really sure with the database. They can put their information in and they will find it. You know, one of my students, she's like, hey, I would like, all of the most recent assessments on trauma, right? And they're like, okay. I'm like, that's a pretty broad request. And she ended up with like 20 like in her email, like the pros and cons of it. And I'm like, oh my goodness gracious, like this is such a resource and people should avail themselves of these wonderful, wonderful folks who are here to help us and know all the ins and outs of searching. If we don't have something at UC, we do have interlibrary loan. They can get it for you, and they usually get it for you pretty quickly, which is such a blessing. Don't don't work harder, work smarter. And they know how, and they definitely know how to get you the information that you need. Other places to search your course materials, right? If you are in sort of research methods, or if you're in a course like assessment, there's plenty of resources posted. You typically have a textbook. So oftentimes they're citing research all throughout textbooks. Your lecture notes and lecture slides most likely have references. Definitely avail yourself of the resources that you already have. Publications from professional organizations are helpful. Databases like JSTOR. If you're going to go ahead and do searches like Academic Search Complete or EBSCOhost or something like that, make sure that you click that button peer reviewed, because we really want to see peer reviewed data out there and in our literature review. For some people who might be doing more sort of public policy related things, they might have to then look at government databases and things like that. I know from my own dissertation, I had to pull heavily from the CDC and their databases to pull my data. But for the most part, if you're writing a term paper or something like that, you can get that through EBSCOhost, and then Google Scholar. So if you love Google, I love Google. I think we all love Google. You can use it, but please type in Google Scholar and get the Scholar box that comes up. And I think that's really helpful. It's also really helpful in Google Scholar because you can also narrow your band of searching. So it can just be within a certain year. I know when I'm teaching some classes, I'm like, listen, I would like you preferably to have most of your references within the last 10 years. For something that's a lot more recent, preferably last 5. However, if there is some seminal study or seminal book that sort of kicked off the whole thing, feel free to reference that. I do think it's always important to reference back to who got it all started. One of my students last semester in the research methods class did something on updated Adlerian techniques. Well, yes, Adler's work has not been in the last 10 years, right? But that was still included as sort of the kickoff point to get to where we are today and how to use these techniques with different populations, which I thought was pretty interesting. So these databases are great for that because you can get the best information that's most relevant to your topic in a pretty short order. So definitely take advantage of all the resources that you have here. So reading. This is the part I think that can take a very long time, right? Um, let's say you went ahead and you did your research and you have 10 articles to read. And a lot of them are weighty, right? You have to sift yourself through all of the results and, the findings and, did they pull the correct amount of participants? Did they use some sort of other method? I used to give this assignment about critiquing research, and I think people are very nice, especially in our field. They're very empathetic. They typically look for the best in other people, very strength based. And it's like, how do I say this nicely that you don't have enough participants? Or how do I say this nicely that this is a pretty obvious finding? And I think sometimes you have to read with that eye. And I think that's a very different task than just reading to read, right? Here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to ask ourselves, who's this author? What's their purpose? Do they have a particular perspective? What methodology are they using? Who's the audience? How is their position supported? There are studies out there that you'll start to read it and you're like, okay, this is great. This is going to be really good. And then you start reading through the results and you're like, I don't understand how you got that. I don't understand how you're making these claims based on what you just did. Okay. And how do we read this critically? Because I think this is important, even if you don't plan to get a PhD, even if you don't want to publish articles or, write a dissertation, I still think it's really important to be able to read our counseling journals and say, oh, this new thing that you're talking about and this bright, shiny new technique, I'm going to read it. And then I'm going to be like, no, no. So sometimes you have to be like, is it just smoke and mirrors, or is this really good? Because I tell you what, there's some studies that I'll read in like the Journal of Counseling Development, and I've not heard of that study before, and I'm reading this. I'm like, this is amazing. Like, why aren't we doing this? Like, these findings are incredible. Like, where has this been all my life? There was an article not too long ago on mentorship, especially for mentoring in research. It's like, how do you learn to be a researcher? And one of the best ways to do so is to be with somebody who is a competent researcher, right? And to be taught like an apprenticeship, like somebody who is learning in any new skill or trade or art. Like to come alongside and say, okay, this now we got this. for a second, didn't I? Did I freeze? I froze, right?
Yes, you did, but you came back.
Okay. Okay, I'm back. Whew. Whew. Yeah. So one of the best ways to really learn how to be a good researcher is to be with somebody who is a good researcher, right? To have that experience and to have that mentorship. And we go, oh yeah, of course, right? But is there some intentionality about that in programs? That's something I think that we do try to do here at UC. And I'm not sure if other programs do. So what we have to do is we have to read with intention. Um, and then here's the fun part, or I think it's fun. You might not think it's fun, is the analysis, right? How do you assess this existing research? How do you assess what's out there? And right, the literature reviews just never a list of studies. It's really this argument about the whole body of research. And so this analysis occurs on two levels, right? There's the individual sources that you're analyzing, but then you're also analyzing the whole body of research. So, for example, there are primarily really four analytical tasks, and I'm going to group them. So, there's the summarizing, the synthesizing, the critique, and the compare. So after you write your brief summary of the other literature, you have to also combine the sources in a logical manner. How are the sources that you chose connected? How are they not? Right? This also helps to make it clear how your project or research is linked to the larger topic. And this is where you can begin to judge literature based on your developing expertise on the subject. Because after reading how many studies and really immersing yourself in all of this work, you are beginning to develop expertise. What's out there, what's not out there, what the gaps are, how you can contribute in a meaningful way. So these are some things where you are demonstrating what you've learned from others in your field and that your research is a starting point to new ideas. Really what happens in this analytical task is we learn how your research matters and how it contributes to the big picture. So the first, sort of grouping is the summary and synthesis. So what I often find when I am reviewing comprehensive exams or I am looking at papers is people are great at summarizing. They're really good at taking sort of the words of other people and saying, okay, here's what they said, right? But how does that make sense? And how does that make sense in terms of the context of your review, in context with other things that you have read? What are the different arguments and how do they all relate? Right? That is the part that sometimes ends up reading like an extended annotated bibliography, right? It's like this person, the study said, you know, miracles occur every day. And then this person said that miracles occur sometimes. And then this person said, like, instead of just sort of weaving it together, right? So that can often happen. It can also happen that, and I've seen this before too, where people start to annotate their literature, which is great, because what you're doing when you're annotating is you're really familiarizing yourself, and you're talking about how many participants they had, what methods they used, what their findings were. That's a great thing. I really love annotations. But then what happens is it's very convenient to start setting up your literature review in that same way and people just kind of move it over. It is not the same thing. When I teach research methods, I'm like, okay, here's the difference. Like, here's how we can structure this so that you know what this is versus this, because you kind of have to do both in that class. So it's really important to use both tools of summary and synthesis in your literature review. And so, here's just some sample language, right? So if we're going to go with Freud and Bowlby and all of that, right? So, in terms of summary, for Freud demonstrated that, the personality consists of the id, the ego, and the superego, right? Early work by Bowlby was concerned with attachment and attachment pairings and dyads, right? Additional work by Joyner, Van Orden, et al., and they're suicidologists. So maybe what something is pointing to here is maybe some sort of interpersonal theory of suicide and how that might be a risk factor when people don't have their life supported by others, right? So things like that. So this is some sample language. I have a whole list of language soon. You'll see. It's good stuff. I think. So and then for another example is an example of summary and synthesis. Piaget's theory of stages of cognitive development and Erickson's stages of psychosocial development are commonly used for educational psych courses. And then I talk about Piaget, and so this is how we can sort of pull it all together without saying Piaget says this, Erickson says this, right? Piaget then says this, right? So there's a way to sort of weave the story together so that we're covering those points. Um, we also have comparison and critique. And so I think sometimes this is missing from literature reviews that I've seen. We need to know the strengths and weaknesses of the work, especially in terms of the established literature, especially if your study is going to sort of either disprove or make a mark in some way to fill some gap that's there. What needs further testing? What evidence is lacking or inconclusive? What methods seem really unsatisfactory, right? There's a lot of studies out there. I'll give you an example from sort of my own research on suicide that is quantitative. They pull data from the CDC or from hospital systems or insurers or surveys or things like that, right? And so there's a lot of quant out there, and you can have a good old time playing with all of the variables. Um, However, there seems to be a lacking of qualitative research, and there's plenty of quant studies that say that. Like, and by the way, we should really get this other perspective. I have a student right now who is interested in the intersection of eating disorders and ACEs, so the adverse childhood experiences. And so what she's looked at, a lot of quant studies have been done recently. And they're like, yeah, hey, look, typically if you still have an eating disorder in adulthood that materialized in adolescence or earlier, usually it's connected to having 5 ACEs or more, right? And we're looking at childhood neglect, we're looking at abuse, we're looking at those kinds of things. And they each of these new studies, one was from 2021, one was from 2022, like, somebody really should do qualitative work, right? Somebody should actually, we're not doing that. We just did our survey. This is great. But somebody should do that. So when she's reading through the literature, she's like, it looks like we're missing this piece. We're missing the voices of the people who are actually living with this, who are having this eating disorder persist from the time they're 16 to the time they're 46. What does that look like? What is their experience? How does that differ from somebody who might be diagnosed at 16, does an intensive program, and has it pretty much in recovery or remission by the time they're 18 or 20, right? That's a very different kind of pattern. What does that look like? So sometimes when we look at the methods, that's where you can make an impact. You're like, well, this hasn't been done in this way yet. So comparison and critique, I think, is something that we really need to engage with our literature reviews. Um, Here's some sample language for comparison and critique. Baumeister, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the study. It's on ego depletion. It was like super, super famous. People loved it. I'm saying it was probably cited like thousands of times, and they found that it was bunk. It's not accurate at all. I know. Look, Jennifer's like, what? Yeah, I'm totally like the replication crisis in psychology. I'm just gonna go ahead and bracket off right now. LoriAnn's probably like, please, Jan, don't go off script. And Patty's laughing because I go off script all the time. So it is one of those things where, it sounds great. It sounds really great. And you're like, yes, that's exactly what happens. And then like the data just doesn't support it. But because people want to buy into it and they want to like believe, right? They, just gets picked up and it's like, well, it seems to make sense. Well, it doesn't make sense. So it was flawed. And there's so many studies out there that have been shown not to be accurate, replicated, lies, lies. I could go on, but I won't. So and then other things where you're talking about, maybe some other results have reflection of stages of change. Miller and Rollinick are the ones who did the whole atheoretical model with Prochaska and De Clemente on that really is the basis for motivational interviewing. That's sort of Miller and Rollinick's shtick, right? So they pulled the trans theoretical model and they used that for their stages of change in MI. So there's been a lot of, especially in the substance use disorder literature and recovery literature on stages of change. So maybe this like little blurb is about pulling in these different pieces and comparing them. Okay, it looks like there's just another riff off of what they're trying to do. in their study, right? So it's not that new, not that extra. You just put a different name on it, right? It's very similar. So we need to be able to read critically and to be able to compare all of the work at hand, right? I have another little example. I like examples clearly. So things like nurture as primacy model has also received a share of criticism. One of the most frequently cited shortcomings of this approach centers on the assumption that individuals in the world are seen as like a blank slate, right? And all of their knowledge comes from perception and experience. For those of you who have kids who are interested in child development, I'm sure you've been very well versed in, is it nature? Is it nurture? Right? Because if it's in nature, it doesn't really matter what you do, right? Like your kid is your kid and they're just going to grow up and be their own person, right? If it's all nurture, well then mama, you better get to work, right? So we need those violin lessons and the chore charts and all the things because we want to not only make them feel loved and supported, but also build resiliency, right? It's both. Like, let's be real, it's both. They're their own people, and they also are shaped by their environment, experiences, peers, socio-historical context. Yay, Brofenbrenner, he is very true with his whole biological ecological model. It's fantastic, love it. But if we think about when we're comparing and critique, in this example, it's comparing and critiquing an aspect of a model, right? Um, so use your words. Here's some evaluative words that feel free to steal, because sometimes I think we come up with we use the same words often, just to have some, maybe I can like use this. And people typically are very nice in our field, so they'll use a limited, or they'll say it's important or competent. And I'm like, you can call something flawed if it's flawed. You know, you can say something's lacking. You can also say something is really comprehensive and innovative. And, so definitely use your words. If there's a study that is great and it is setting you up very well for your research questions, you can drive it home and sing its praises. If the seminal study is lacking in some way and everyone's just followed suit, you should definitely offer your critiques about that. So sometimes being able to have some vocabulary right there to be able to do it's really helpful. And then again, putting it all together. Once you do all of this, right? Once you do all of these seemingly simple tasks, now what do you know about the field? What do the other research know about the field and what don't they know, right? Why should we further study this topic and what will your study contribute, right? So when we've done all this, now we can get to the good part, writing. We have to start somewhere. It is totally okay to have a really terrible first draft. In fact, I highly recommend it. Right? Because there's nowhere to go but up. And I've told so many of my students, and Patty's like, oh, you're a broken record. I'm like, I am a broken record. Um, I'm like, you have to put something on paper. Like, I don't care what it is. Like, it can be your grocery list. I don't care what it is. I need something. No one ever sent me their grocery list, by the way. I need something to be able to edit and give you feedback on. I cannot give you feedback on a blank piece of paper. That's just a no-go. Like, give me something. Give me anything. So I think it just helps to start writing. And part of the way that I encourage people to start writing is by outlining, right? Outlining is where you create a very detailed, organization of what you're going to write. So you break each topic and section down and down and down and down, and then you end up with these nice little chunks. So now you know that you only have to write maybe 100 words or 250 words on this particular thing in this section, and that seems like a much easier task. That's it. We just chunk it. For some of my students who've had trouble sort of getting started, I'm like, okay, use the outline or the template that's been provided maybe in the dissertation handbook. When I'm teaching 638, I have like an FAQ, like you need an intro, you need a background, you need this. And I like define each one of them. I'm like, this is what we mean by significance of the study. This is what we mean by your problem statement. And just copy and paste it over. And then you know what you have to fill in. The same is true for your literature review. So if you are talking about maybe um, childhood trauma, and you want to go through each of the ACEs, right? You want to talk about that at large. Great. So then you're going to talk about the ACEs, and then you might talk about each of the individual ACEs and the literature that surrounds that, right? And so you're definitely going to start broad, and then you're going to funnel for each one of them. And maybe your specific topic is the intersection on childhood trauma and neglect, and neglect being a primal factor in terms of sort of foster placements and things of that nature, and feelings of low self-worth, and da, 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 da. And maybe that's sort of your angle. Great. So outline it, and just start to fill in each of those pieces. I think when people have an outline, the lift is much lighter than it would be without. Just to sit there with the cursor blinking and nothing's on the page. At least if you have a structure, you have somewhere to go. So I've had this on my computer forever because my dissertation chair sent it to me, because she's like, "This is you." You're like, "I need to write my literature review, but I need to redo my baby's nursery because, now that he's 6 months old, he needs a different kind of nursery. We need to move from the nautical theme to trains or planes or maybe automobiles. I don't know yet, but it's going to change. And I will say, like, my house had never been so clean than when I was having to write my chapter 2 of my lit review. I had the world's most perfect eyebrows. Um, they got managed a few times a day. Julia's feeling me. She's like nodding her head. She's like, yes, agreed. I had to volunteer for everything at my preschool for my daughter, right? I had to be that mom. I was present for everything. And they're like, aren't you getting a doctorate? Don't you have a baby? I'm like, yeah, yeah. They're like, when will you be done? Soon. Like, right? Like, so because you're in that, and it's like, oh. And right? Your nails were flawless, weren't they? They looked great. You're like, yes. But that's what happens. We tend to be like, oh, this is hard. So let me go do all these other tasks so I look really, really productive in other aspects of my life because I'm not productive in this aspect. It's really important to have an accountability partner if this is you. Um, I somehow have friends who are not procrastinators. They just do their work. Like, I'm married to somebody like that. Like, they just like do their work. And I'm like, you didn't make a cup of tea and like light a candle and like then get some sparkling water and then some water and then like pet the dog. Oh, like, you don't have to do all that before you work, right? Um, so oftentimes we have to sit down and write it, and one of the ways to do it is to start with, your thesis, to print it out, to hang it up. What is your argument? Like, what are you doing in terms of your overview? What's your aim for all of this in light of your bigger study? Cut it out, print it out, put it on a sticky note. I used to have a little piece of paper that said write or nothing will change, and then it got replaced when my daughter first heard Rihanna's work, 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 work song. So she decided to take a whole pack of sticky notes and write work on sticky notes and like wallpaper my office with it. So then I would look over there. I'm like, I guess I have to work. So sometimes having a thesis statement is real, that you can time. Yep. So there's some examples that you can use, but there's other ways to organize it. So every literature review doesn't look the same, right? So here are just 5 common approaches to organizing the body of your literature review. The first one's topical. This is really the most common approach. This is the one that most people use. It breaks the field into the subfields or subject areas. Each section is done individually, sometimes with critiques. It's really helpful, I think, in dissertations because we have this huge body of work, and usually students have multiple threads coming together like a braid. And so this is a way for them to be able to not only organize it, but also to be able to give each section its due and allow some critiques in there as well. Um, Another one is distant to close. And so it's organized as relevant to your research. So, I have a prior master from before I did counseling from a different university, and we did a lot of modeling. We did like causal modeling with like Bayesian techniques and path analyses. And so we were always looking at different techniques. And so we often did things organized in terms of relevant to what we're doing now. So the closer that we got to our topic, it got more relevant. So we started broad and came all the way back down. So it might say something like, um, this method or model is very slightly similar to the current research, and you start there. And then it's drawing upon that model can help with this. And the study most applies, related to this procedure and model over here that's similar to our current research. So there's a way to do it and to funnel it down in terms of relationships. Another piece is a debate. So like, let's say you are having some topic and there's all these different approaches, right? So I think we can think about other arguments within psychotherapy where some people might say, well, you have to use this approach for, you know, this mental health condition or symptom, or, maybe you need this approach or that approach. And, I've worked in the field long enough that, you know, chances are that it depends is definitely is definitely a right answer for a lot. But, I've read some literature about, when you're working with people who are, say, sexual assault survivors, that, maybe you don't do a narrative approach or you do some sort of approach like that. Instead, you might do somatic experience or EMDR or something like that because they want to focus on the body, right? So maybe in that literature, there is a level of debate where it's here's this approach, here's what other people say about the approach, here's the evidence for it, and here's in the literature where it conflicts, right? And so maybe that's the argument within the literature review, and then the debate is taken up within that structure. And then wherever your study comes down on it, or maybe your study is to try to figure out what's right and what's wrong, you know, that's a way to organize it as well. Sometimes people do chronological, and in order to show a paradigm shift. I've seen this in terms of when people are looking at sort of educational policies or updates in curriculum or updates in sort of ethical standards. Oftentimes you want to see this is where we started and this is how we've gotten to the point we are now, right? So this is another one. I've seen a couple of dissertations use the chronological, but usually chronological, we're looking at that more in articles or maybe in a paper. And then last but certainly not least is the seminal study, right? We start with this the huge study, right? Some big seminal work. Maybe it is, the big Kaiser Permanente ACEs study, right? Anybody who's doing work on childhood trauma, they're going to cite that study. Like they have to cite that study, right? So maybe they're talking about the description of that as a whole, and then the organ. Again, this is just great. Good times in Georgia. It's the freeze. It's the freeze, Betty. It's the freeze. So oftentimes when we look at something like a seminal study, you're going to say the most important research on the topic was the study by X on the state, and then it's following the study. Research fell into 2 camps, 3 camps, and extended their work. And you can see this oftentimes when we're looking at, even if we think about counseling theories, right? We can think about Albert Ellis and REBT, right? We're like, yeah, that was great. And then Beck was like, that was good, but I'm going to go ahead and change it a little bit. And I'm going to add this and take this out. And hey, look, now I have a Nobel Peace Prize. Sorry, Al. Right. So, you can start with that and how we've approached it. But, essentially he took a strain of his work, made it his own, added things to it. And now we all use CBT as the most evidence-based treatment for treating major depressive disorder, along with other things. So sometimes, you want to start with the seminal work and then weave your way into the groundwork for your own research. Again, also with organizing, I think it's helpful to have concept maps. I got permission from 2 of my current students to share their sort of concept map for their dissertations, for their chapter 2s. I think oftentimes it's really helpful. So they centered what their study is about. They have their theory space and then what the problem and interventions are. So this is one way to do it. Another way to do it is sort of do it maybe linear. So in addition to here's the research question, the type of inquiry, and the specific sort of approach that this students using, there's also then the theory frame. And then because this person's focusing on college counselors and their experience of burnout during the pandemic. And I was a college counselor during the pandemic, and it was stressful. It was stressful. Everyone else had some time to get online, everything else. They're like, are you have to be ready. Your caseload is still your caseload. I know that you have to homeschool multiple children and you know, all of these other things too, but good luck. Still make sure you see 40 students. Oh, and supervise your supervisees and teach. Yes, you're welcome. Happy pandemic, right? So there is this thread that she's looking at burnout, right? But she's also looking at sort of college counselors, and usually, historically, it was the role of the college counselor just to be there as support, maybe sometimes academic work. And now they are doing full on clinical mental health for a lot of folks who might have some severe and persistent mental health symptoms and conditions. So it's definitely escalated since its intention, which I think is probably part of the issue. Also, in your lit review, you're going to want to go ahead and do an introduction, just like anything else in life. Just to provide some background and introduce your topic, make your claim. I think having a map or overview is really helpful because then it lets your reader know where you're going, right? What to expect, what to anticipate. And you definitely need a conclusion. You need to be able to wrap it up in a pretty little bow. Because you're setting that up. If you're doing a dissertation, you're setting this chapter up as these are the methods that I'm using now for my study. Now that I've established the literature and I've established the need for the study in the literature, here's what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, right? And how I'm going about it. So it's all connected. If it's just simply a paper, like let's say for a 638, what you're going to do from there is I'm pretty sure in that paper, the next section is methods, right? So it is sort of this mini proposal in there where you are going to summarize it, say, so what, here's why I'm doing this research. And in the next section or the next chapter, I will discuss the methods used, right? So citing sources, super, super important. If it's not your idea, you have to document it, paraphrasing key ideas. One of my pet peeves, and I'm pretty sure Dr. Stretch would probably say the same thing, is when people will overly quote and block quote, block quote, block quote throughout papers. Like you can paraphrase and cite, you can go, you're right. I mean, it's one of those things. I'm like, this isn't your work. This is very good, like copying and pasting. And I'm glad that you cited it. But when I see the safe assign score and it's like 82, like, no, let me go ahead and let you know that this isn't your writing, right? This is your copy and pasting. So part of being a scholar is to be able to make sense of the words on the page and to put them in your own language, your own words, and to relate it to the other sources in a meaningful way. I could get really stuck on that, right? I want to hear their words too. Like I want to hear them, and I see the same thing when in my grief class. We do a treatment plan, and I'm like, I know that most of you don't have a lot of experience in treatment planning, and that's okay, right? We all start somewhere, we all learn, and some of you might have the Jongsma books, right, on treatment planning. Cool. It's a great resource. Whatever you do not go into the Jongsma book and copy and paste a treatment plan. I would like to know who you are as a clinician. I want to know what you think you would do. Feel free to look at that, especially because I like how he has like now evidence-based practice on there. I'm like, ooh, I like that. I was like, go ahead and look that up. So I think that's important. I think it's nice to see, an expert in treatment planning, and how they would set it up. But I also want to know sort of their theoretical instincts and and how they would approach a client. It would probably be very different from how I approach a client, right? And so I want to see that. I want to see their voice in that assignment, just like I want to see everyone's voices when they're writing their literature reviews and, any other paper that they have, because, that's important. I think we all have a unique role to play in our profession, whether that's as a scholar, a researcher, a clinician, or all of the above, right? And if we are trying to use other people's voices instead of our own, I don't think that's a good idea. But I do think it's important to give credit where credit is due and then add your piece. Um, okay, revising. No, you're not done yet, right? So you've done all the other steps, right? We're on step 6. And oftentimes, this is what I've found, and not everybody feels like this, but they turn in their chapter 2. Their long, long, long chapter 2. And then they're like, no, I'm done. And I'm like, oh, but wait, there's more. But wait, add this section. But wait, this needs more support. Uh, Not this section, but this section. And so the revision process is quite extensive. It just is. And it's interesting because sometimes, people will start to have a topic in mind beforehand. They'll start pre-writing, and then they'll want to just copy and paste that into their new chapter 2. Yeah, and that's not gonna work. And that is not gonna work. Yes, exactly, Dr. Stretch, yes, and or this goes in a different chapter or that chapter, and you start moving things around. I'll see a lot of stuff in their chapter 1 that I'm like, I appreciate the background, but that's too much. I don't need a 10-page background in chapter 1, right? No, 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 you can put that in 2. They're like, "But I already said that in chapter 2." Okay, so parking lot that. 'Cause it kinda breaks their heart to have written, like, 10 pages that I'm now like, "Forget it." So I'm like, "Put it in the parking lot. Maybe you'll use it later." You don't you ever use the parking lot. That's the secret of the parking lot. Like, you're never going there. It's just a place to put your car, right? You don't care about the parking lot, right? As long as it's well lit and spaces are good and you're not parking in between 2 monster trucks, like, you're cool. Like, you just don't ever go there again. Some tips on revising. Titles, like, is the title consistent with the paper, right? Sometimes I'll see titles that are like, super, 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 super long, and Dr. Stretch, you'll laugh too, because how many titles have you seen? The lived experience of masters in clinical mental health counseling students as they approach their first client with major depressive disorder. Like, stop it, stop it. Right? Like, let's come up with something else. Like, let's just make a nice title, right? It doesn't have to be this lengthy thing. Do you properly introduce your review? Do you have a clear claim? You know, is this organization clear? Did you start with an outline and maybe give us a concept map? I do love a map. I would never be mad if somebody wrote a chapter 2 and had a map. Love it. Love maps, love charts, love graphs, love them all. Um, the transitions piece is also really important. Actually met with a student last night, and her literature review is huge. It is ginormous. It kind of has to be for her topic, but she's great within her sections. But there's no linkages between the sections, right? It's like, now we're going to talk about this. And then there's like air, right? And then we're going to talk about this. And like, there has to be connections between these pieces. And I use the analogy, like, we have to stitch them together, right? It's like we're making a dress. We have sleeves, we have the skirt, we have the bodice, we have the zipper, we have the buttons, but we need to actually stitch it together to make a dress, because otherwise it's just cutouts, right? So it's really, really important to transition. Having a good closure, again, spelling, grammar, all that's great for people who are writing dissertations. I really recommend editors, because you're so used to your own work, and by the time you get to proposal, your chair is so used to your work that you're like, you don't catch any sort of errors. Like, you're just like, what, it's fine. I've read that before, it's cool. But editors, a fresh set of eyes, even peer review is really good for catching mistakes. Grammarly is fantastic too, highly recommend. I use it in my work quite a bit. So yeah, so those are just some tips on revising. I have some summaries. We really do have to be thinking about not only summary but also the analysis piece. And like I said, when I'm looking at comps, a lot of times I'm seeing a lot of good research. There's a lot of summary, you know, there's not that much synthesis and analysis. And I I'm going to probably say half of the comps that I read, I talk about that in terms of my qualitative feedback and suggesting articles for them to read. The same is true when I'm working with my 638 students. I'm like, this reads like an annotated bibliography. I really need you to engage with the literature and have everybody at the cocktail party speaking, right? And not isolated on their own sofas, having their own party. Um, for those of you who are grad students, which I think you all are, we have a graduate writing support center. They'll give you feedback on your paper. Um, it's a wonderful resource. The formal close for the fall semester on the 23rd. Um, you know, because they have to prepare to finish any sort of reviews and things like that. And then it reopens at the beginning of January. I highly recommend it. Just having a fresh set of eyes of people who are professional writers and are trained to give you feedback. They're not going to give you feedback about like the content per se, right? But they can give you feedback about structure and flow and the writing. So, as a student here, you pay for this. Get your money's worth, right? Get all your money's worth. So it just has some references. I love this article. It's Boot and Beal. It's called Scholars Before Researchers and talking about the literature review and dissertation. But I do think it's broadly applicable for any paper. And it really does drive home the synthesis and analysis piece to the literature review. I also like this, while it's in the Library of Science, and it's for computational biology, it's a really actually accessible article. It's like 10 simple rules for writing a literature review, things to keep in mind. And then I have a bunch of resources. We do have the Writing Center here at UC and the Learning Commons. Penn State has a lot of resources. They actually have a graduate writing center there where they put on programs and lit reviews, and they do peer support and writing clubs and journal clubs and all kinds of things. And then here's some other resources out there too. That's all I got. Happy to take any sort of questions. Hope I didn't make your mind spin with all the literature review stuff. It's a lot, I know, but it is, if you think about it, it sets up your whole study. It justifies the need for what you're doing and why you're doing it. Without this piece, what's the point, right? What's the even point? Because what you're doing here is you're showing that you understand the literature that is already existing and how you are contributing in your own way. Dr. Stretch, I know you have some changes now that you're here at UC and the director of our scholarly engagement about starting all the dissertation process just with chapter 2. Like really immerse yourself in the research before you start asking questions, right? I think that is just like the best approach, right? It's like, let's know what we have to work with and where the gaps are before I start trying to make my mark and claiming something for myself when it's already been done, right? Because that sometimes happens. People are like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. And then I'm like, I think that was done, right? And then they feel like a deflated little balloon and you're like, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'll scoop you up and we'll try to find something else. So happy to take any questions. And if not, thank you so much for being here on a Friday afternoon.